In the darkest heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, there existed a place of man-made hell. It was a prison not for criminals, but for an entire people. This was the Warsaw Ghetto, a section of the Polish capital walled off from the rest of the world, where hundreds of thousands of Jewish men, women and children were sealed away to await their doom. It was a world of starvation, disease, and brutal, random violence, a waiting room for the death camps. To enter this place was to risk your own life. To defy the German authorities who ran it was to invite torture and execution. Yet one young Polish woman, a social worker armed with nothing but a nurse's uniform and an iron will, walked into this hell day after day. She did so with a single secret and breathtakingly audacious purpose: to smuggle its most vulnerable inhabitants, its children, to safety. Her name was Irena Sendler. This is the story of how she and her network of conspirators saved an estimated 2,500 Jewish children from the Holocaust, spiriting them away from their doomed parents in toolboxes, potato sacks, and even coffins. To comprehend the magnitude of Irena's courage, one must first understand the reality of the Warsaw Ghetto. In 1940, the German occupation forces ordered the construction of a massive wall, over 10 feet high and topped with barbed wire, enclosing a small 1.3 square mile area of the city. Into this tiny space, they forced nearly 500,000 Jews. The conditions were deliberately designed to be lethal. Food rations were set at starvation levels, often less than 200 calories a day. The overcrowding was unimaginable, with multiple families crammed into a single room. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis ran rampant, claiming thousands of lives every month. The bodies of those who had starved to death overnight would be collected on carts in the morning, their faces covered with newspaper. Children with swollen bellies and skeletal limbs begged for a single crust of bread. And through it all patrolled the German guards, who could beat or shoot a person for the slightest infraction, or for no reason at all. It was a place designed to strip people of their humanity before it stripped them of their lives. Irena Sendler was not Jewish. She was a Polish Catholic, a senior administrator in the Warsaw Social Welfare Department. Before the war, she had overseen the city's canteens, which provided food and financial aid to the poor and orphaned. When the Germans invaded and created the ghetto, her Jewish friends and colleagues were forced inside. Irena was horrified by the injustice and the barbarism she was witnessing. She was a woman of deep moral conviction, raised by her physician father, who had taught her a simple, powerful lesson: help anyone who is drowning, regardless of their religion or nationality. In the Warsaw Ghetto, an entire people were drowning, and Irena knew she could not stand by and watch. Using her official position, Irena managed to obtain a special pass that allowed her to enter the ghetto. The Germans permitted a few non-Jewish Polish health workers inside, ostensibly to contain the spread of infectious diseases and prevent them from reaching the areas and the Aryan side of the city. For the Germans, it was a matter of selfish sanitation. For Irena, it was an opportunity. Every day, she would put on her nurse's uniform, pin a Star of David armband on her sleeve in a sign of solidarity, and walk through the heavily guarded gates into the heart of the ghetto. She and her trusted colleagues began by smuggling in food, medicine and money to their trapped Jewish friends. In the summer of 1942, the Germans began the Gross Action Warsaw, the Great Action, This was the code name for the mass deportation of the ghetto's inhabitants to the Treblinka extermination camp. Every day, thousands of Jews were rounded up, forced onto cattle cars, and sent to their deaths. It became terrifyingly clear that saving lives was no longer about smuggling food. It was about smuggling people. Specifically, it was about smuggling children, who were small enough to be hidden, and young enough, perhaps, to be saved. Irena became a key figure in a secret underground network called Żegota, the Polish Council to Aid Jews. She directed its children's section, a clandestine group of about 24 people, mostly women, who were willing to risk everything. Their mission was staggeringly dangerous. They had to convince terrified Jewish parents to part with their own children, knowing they would likely never see them again. This was a choice of unimaginable agony. How do you hand your child over to a stranger, sending them out into a hostile world, on the faint hope that they might survive? Irena would visit families in their squalid apartments, her heart breaking as she made her case. She would tell them, "I can offer no guarantees. I cannot even guarantee that the child will leave the ghetto alive. But I can guarantee you that if they stay here, they will die." Some parents refused. They could not bear the separation. Others, seeing the brutal reality of the daily roundups, would agree. Their goodbyes a silent torment of tears and last embraces. They would dress their child in their best clothes, give them one last kiss, and hand them over to Irena. Then came the second, equally perilous part of the mission: getting the child out of the ghetto. Irena and her network developed a number of ingenious and heart-stopping methods. The most common route was through the old Warsaw courthouse, a building that had one entrance on the ghetto side and another on the Aryan side. A friendly Polish janitor would help coordinate the escapes, smuggling children through the building's basements. For smaller children and infants, more desperate measures were required. Irena would arrange for them to be sedated with a small dose of phenobarbital to keep them from crying at the wrong moment. They would then be placed in whatever container was available. Some were hidden in potato sacks or wooden crates carried by sympathetic Polish workers leaving the ghetto. Some were tucked into the toolboxes of tradesmen. On several occasions, Irena herself used her medical kit, which had a false bottom, to carry an infant to safety. One of the most ghoulish and effective methods was to use ambulances. A friendly driver would enter the ghetto, ostensibly to collect victims of typhus. A living child would be hidden under a sheet on a stretcher, next to a real corpse, or sometimes hidden inside a coffin. The German guards, terrified of contracting the disease, would rarely inspect the ambulance's cargo too closely. Another method involved hiding children in a streetcar that ran through the ghetto. A trusted driver would stop his tram, and a conspirator would toss a child wrapped in a bundle out the window to a waiting Żegota member on the other side. Every escape was a moment of pure terror. The sound of a guard's boots, the bark of a dog, a child's muffled cry. Any of these could mean death for the child and the rescuer. Irena had a driver who would bring his dog with him in his truck. If he was carrying a hidden child who began to cry, he would hit the dog, and its yelps would drown out the sound of the baby. These were the split-second decisions and desperate gambles upon which young lives depended. Once a child was successfully smuggled out, the work was still not over. They needed a new identity, a new life. Irena's network had forged thousands of fake identity documents, including baptismal certificates. The children were placed in a network of safe houses, and from there they were sent to live with Polish foster families, or hidden away in convents and orphanages. Finding families willing to take in a Jewish child was incredibly difficult. In Nazi-occupied Poland, hiding a Jew was an offence punishable by death, not just for the individual, but for their entire family. Every person who took in a child was signing their own potential death warrant. But Irena's mission went one step further. She was not just content to save their lives, she was determined to save their identities. She believed that one day, after the war, these children would need to know who they really were, what their real names were, and who their parents had been. So, for every child she saved, she created a secret record. She wrote down their real name and their new, adopted name on a tiny slip of tissue paper. This was her most precious and most dangerous secret. She kept these slips of paper hidden in her apartment, but as the list grew to contain thousands of names, she knew it was too dangerous to keep it there. She found a trusted friend, and they placed the lists inside 2 glass jars. In the middle of the night, they went to her friend's garden and buried the jars under an apple tree. Those jars contained the only remaining link to the past for thousands of children. For over a year, Irena and her network operated in the shadows, pulling child after child from the jaws of the ghetto, but their luck was bound to run out. In October of 1943, the Gestapo, the brutal German secret police, finally caught up with her. They had been tipped off, likely by an informant. In the middle of the night, they stormed her apartment. As they burst through the door, Irena, in a moment of incredible presence of mind, managed to grab the latest list of names she had been compiling and toss it to her friend, who hid it in her underclothing. The Gestapo found nothing. The Gestapo wanted names. They wanted to know about the Shigota network. They broke her feet and her legs, but Irena Sendler never said a word. She gave up no names, betrayed no one. Finally, they gave up. She was sentenced to death by firing squad. The underground managed to raise a large sum of money and bribe a Gestapo guard. On the day of her scheduled execution, as she was being led out, the bribed guard pulled her aside and told her to run. He then added her name to the list of those who had already been executed. Officially, Irena Sendler was dead. She spent the rest of the war in hiding, using a false identity, but her work had been saved. After the war ended, Irena and her surviving friends went back to the garden. They dug up the 2 glass jars from under the apple tree. The precious lists were still there. They set about the monumental task of trying to find the children they had saved, and if possible, reunite them with any surviving relatives. Tragically, in almost all cases, the parents of the children had perished, either in the ghetto or in the gas chambers of Treblinka. For the 2,500 children Irena had saved, she was the only link to their past. For decades after the war, Irena Sendler's story was largely unknown. Poland's new communist government downplayed the role of non-communist resistance heroes, and Irena herself never sought recognition. She did not consider herself a hero. "I could have done more," she would often say, a thought that haunted her for the rest of her life. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when a group of American high school students in Kansas discovered her story for a history project, that her incredible heroism was brought to the world's attention. Irena Sendler was finally given the recognition she so profoundly deserved. She passed away in 2008 at the age of 98. Her legacy is not just in the 2,500 lives she saved, but in the powerful example she set. She was an ordinary person who, when faced with an extraordinary evil, made the choice to act. She was an ember of defiant compassion in the coldest, darkest night of the 20th century. A testament to the fact that one person's courage can, indeed, save the world for thousands.